And welcome to all of our attendees, either good afternoon or good morning, depending upon your time zone. I'm Mal Coles. I'm the Atlantic Area Manager for the corporation, as Jennifer mentioned. I'm going to be ably assisted today by Melissa Allen, who's a state program specialist in our New Jersey office. We're going to explain to you the agenda and what our methodology is going to be, because we have a number of polling questions that we're going to want to engage you in. So next slide, please. Basically, the overview here is on prohibited activities. And we're hopeful that this session will help you understand how to comply with the Senior Corps' prohibited activities policy. There are a number of activities that Senior Corps staff and volunteers may not engage in while they are charging time to their Senior Corps program, while they're accumulating service or training hours, or otherwise performing activities supported by the Senior Corps program grant. This webinar is going to present each of the prohibited activities and a hypothetical scenario that involves the activity. The scenarios are designed to reflect real questions faced by corporation grantees and thus help you practice identifying prohibited activities in action. Next slide, please. The objectives for today, what we'd like to have accomplished, is that by the end of this webinar that you will be able to, number one, identify activities prohibited to volunteers and staff with Senior Corps projects, to determine activities that are specifically prohibited while charging time to the Senior Corps program, and as importantly, to identify the consequences of engaging in prohibited activities. Next slide, please. This is happening in real time, and we appreciate the over 430 of you who have already signed on. It's a great commitment. We're glad you have this level of interest. A couple of the features that are embedded in the technology today is the opportunity to have real-time polling. And we will have 6 individual polling questions. We'll pose a scenario and walk you through. And then you'll have an opportunity to provide your answer. And then when the poll is closed, the instant results will be displayed. And the second feature is to have your questions answered and provide your feedback through the chat feature. And Melissa is going to be managing the chat feature on the fly throughout the presentation so that you'll be able to aggregate questions, find out which ones have the greatest amount of interest, and we will be moving in that direction. Again, the 6 polling questions. The facilitator is going to indicate when a poll is open. You'll have about 15 seconds to respond to the individual questions, and then we will roll up the results, discuss the accurate answer, and give you an opportunity to pose additional chat questions as well. Next slide, please. The agenda, and this may vary a little bit by topic, but we do have basically 7 activities that we're going to be dealing with individually here. Probably run about 6 minutes per, and at the end we'll have an opportunity for even follow-up questions of a more generic nature. The next slide, please. So as you saw on the prior slide, there are essentially 7 different categories of prohibited activities: political activities, non-displacement of employees, compensation, labor, non-discrimination, religious activities, and nepotism. We're going to discuss each of these activities, review a scenario that will challenge you to identify whether or not a prohibited activity has occurred, and we'll then be able to hopefully take your questions at the very end as well. Just as a sort of opportunity here, let you know that all of these prohibited activities are going to be posted at the library on this conference. As well, you can find full definitions for prohibited activities at the corporation website. By the way, this PowerPoint will be available later today at the library as well. And I might also add, some of these will seem very familiar to you, if you're the kind of person who, when they receive their notice of grant award, goes right to the back and starts reading all the fine print on terms and conditions. They're virtually all covered right here. So that being the case, I'd like to go to the next slide, and we'll dive right into the first, which is political activities. And indeed, it says, in general, no part of any senior corps grant or project shall use funds, provide services, or assign personnel to influence the outcome of any election to public office, the passage or defeat of legislation, or provide voter registration materials or transportation to the polls. So in simple language, what does this mean for you as a grantee? It means grantees should be careful to ensure that their projects clearly separate senior corps funded activities from any political activism that individuals or organizations may be involved in. Grantees may risk losing funding if they use project funds, services, or personnel in order to influence a political campaign or legislation. Again, one very important clarification. Being a senior corps volunteer or a senior corps grant employee does not preclude individuals from participation in political activities. However, such activities must be conducted on their own time and at their own expense. Can I have the next slide? We'll move to the scenario. You can see the basic background of the scenario on the slide itself. Emily Newman is the head of Washington United, a nonprofit organization that strives to help local families overcome social and economic barriers to attain self-sufficiency in King County, Washington. One of the programs provided through Washington United is the Senior Companion Program, focused specifically on helping local seniors maintain independence. Washington United receives funding from a variety of sources, but the Senior Companion Program is funded by a grant through the corporation, which Ms. Newman has successfully worked to renew year after year. In addition to her many responsibilities as head of Washington United, Ms. Newman is actively involved in local politics and encourages her staff to stay informed about local issues and relevant legislation. Ms. Newman ensures nonpartisan voter registration information and applications are available to the public at Washington United headquarters at all times. As well, Ms. Newman occasionally takes trips to Olympia, the capital, to pressure legislators to provide further funding for causes that she supports. When she makes those trips, she pays for them out of her own pocket and does not charge her time for the grant. So we're posed for the polling question. And the polling question is, has Ms. Newman violated senior corps terms and conditions? You have about 15 seconds to register your answer, A for yes, B for no, and then we will compile them and we'll come back, review the correct answer, and talk a little bit about it. I think it takes us probably about 30 seconds to rack up the information. I also want to remind you, if you have questions that you want to introduce through the chat room, you are free to do that as well. Okay, the results are in. We've got an enlightened audience here. This is always good to know. This augurs well for the future. The results say, has Ms. Newman violated the terms and conditions? 22% you say yes, a resounding 78% no. I'd like to let you know that the no's are indeed correct. And part of the explanation on this is, although Washington United is generally prohibited from identifying its Senior Companion Program with any voter registration activity, there is an exception to this general prohibition regarding voter registration activity. Specifically, senior corps sponsors such as Washington United are permitted to make nonpartisan voter registration information available on site to the public as long as it is not accompanied with verbal or written support for a candidate or party. And additionally, no senior corps grant funds were used to support Ms. Newman's trip to Olympia. So let me ask Melissa, do we have any particular chat questions that we would want to address right now on political activities?
There are not chat questions related to political activities at this time.
Okay, that's fine. You can, as the presentation unfolds, you have access to the chat room, and if one crosses your mind, we're certainly glad to take it at the end of the presentation. I'd like to move on to the next slide, if we could. Take me one more over to non-displacement. Excellent. So the second category of prohibited activities is non-displacement of employed workers. And essentially, a senior corps volunteer shall not perform any service or duty or engage in any activity which would otherwise be performed by an employee of the sponsor or which would replace the hiring of or result in the displacement of employees. So this is important. That's been part of the fundamental bedrock of our grants for better than 40 years. Let's move, if we can, to the next slide and see the scenario. Plymouth Community Action Programs is a nonprofit group dedicated to building healthy communities through targeted support services. For the majority of their service provision, Plymouth relies on volunteers who donate their time and talents to various community action programs, including RSVP. However, Plymouth does employ 3 full-time staff members who are responsible for tasks such as handling correspondence and organizing events. In the recent economic downturn, Plymouth has received a cut in funding that provided for the salaries of the 3 full-time employees. The organization did their best to reallocate funding from other areas in order to keep the 3 staff members, but were unable to support all 3 salaries and have decided to downsize to 2 full-time employees. In order to keep up with administrative duties, one of the RSVP volunteers is asked to step in and help respond to email correspondence. So here's the polling question. Has the Plymouth Community Action Group violated Senior Corps terms and conditions? Yes or no? The poll is open, and I would ask you to post your answers. Melissa, while we're waiting, do we have any chat room questions related to the issue of non-displacement?
Not related to non-displacement, but I did have 2 come in related to political activities.
Okay, well, let's see the results here,
Sure,
and then we'll try and circle back on political activities. Oh, this is close. It's a squeaker. The yeses are a total of 52%. The noes are a total of 48, and the correct answer is yes. An RSVP volunteer cannot perform any service or duty or engage in any activity which would otherwise be performed by an employed worker. In this case, the volunteer is assuming a responsibility that was previously held by one of the full-time staff. So you want to highlight for me the questions under political activity?
Sure. The first question is it acceptable to place RSVP volunteers at polling places?
It cannot be counted as RSVP service. Those hours cannot be counted towards the requirements of your grant. That does not, however, preclude the individual from working the polls on their own time, but it is not an acceptable station.
Okay.
What else do you...
That's a great transition to another question, which is what if the volunteer is doing work while not on CNCS time, but at the same station?
I'm a little confused. At the same station, does...
Yeah, so it sounds like the person is asking if volunteers can serve at polling stations while not on CNCS time.
Absolutely. They don't forsake their basic freedoms and rights as citizens. They simply can't count those as hours under RCP.
Sure. Okay, so another political related question is, I have some RSVP stations that provide transportation to the voting polls. Can that time be counted? This service is part of a transportation plan in an area with limited public transportation services.
Regrettably, no. I mean, the station can do it in its own right, but it can't use individuals as RSVP volunteers on the clock and have those be countable hours as transportation to the polls.
And I have one more political question and then another employee displacement question came through. So the last political question is, the local election office contacts RSVP for recruitment of election poll workers. The poll workers will be paid by the local election office. Can RSVP assist with obtaining local volunteers for the local election office?
The strict answer is, again, not if the intent is to assign RSVP volunteers to perform that function while on the clock. On the other hand, I think we see no problem if an opportunity for a paid assignment came into an RSVP project. There's no harm with them sharing that opportunity with folks who currently serve as RSVP volunteers, as long as it's abundantly clear that this would be a separate action and that this would not be considered RSVP service per se.
All right, so I have a handful of employee displacement questions. Do we have time for those?
Let's take a couple and then we'll circle back, see how it goes on the other 5 categories. I don't want to shortchange us.
Sure thing. The one question is, what if an RSVP volunteer is working in conjunction with an employee to assist with additional duties assigned to the volunteer, not replacing but enhancing or adding additional supports?
Yeah, I think that poses no problem. I mean, in fact, that's almost inherently one of the missions of RSVP is to build out the capacity of organizations to meet their mission. As long as it's not a zero-sum game, as long as it's a value add, I think we're supportive of that.
Okay, great.
And we, in the interest of time, hold those others in the parking lot. We'll try and circle back.
Okay.
And for the time being, let's move right on to the next category, which is compensation for service. An organization which operates any Senior Corps program shall not request or receive compensation from Senior Corps volunteers or from beneficiaries for services of Senior Corps volunteers. Furthermore, Senior Corps volunteers shall not request or receive compensation from service recipients, their legal guardians, family members, or friends. However, voluntary contributions may be made to the community at large, and volunteer stations may contribute to the financial support of the Senior Corps program. So that's very important. So what does this mean for you, again, in simple language? It means that the service your volunteers provide needs to be their sole contribution to your organization and cannot be paired with monetary contributions. Any compensation your volunteers receive must come from your organization and never from the service recipient or their family. To keep it simple, remember, the volunteer does not pay to serve and the recipient does not pay to be served. So if I have the next slide, we'll review the scenario on compensation. The Montgomery Foundation provides educational support services in the D.C. metro area and sponsors a foster grandparent program. In the past 6 months, the program has become increasingly popular, and the project needs to hire additional staff. However, the foundation does not have the available funds to cover the cost of additional staff. And to increase funding to allow for additional staff, the Montgomery Foundation decided to host a fundraiser and asked each foster grandparent to contribute at least $10 to the event. So the polling question becomes, has the Montgomery Foundation violated Senior Corps terms and conditions? Yes or no? The poll is now open. We ask you to make your selection. Well, we're waiting to rack up. Melissa, you want to circle back and try another non-displacement question? Melissa?
Yes. We actually have a compensation for service question as well, if you wanted to start there.
Compensation for service? Yeah,
yes.
Hold on. Let's see how the poll comes in first.
All right.
And we'll go to the compensation for service and hold the displacement till later.
Okay.
Aha. As Montgomery Foundation, again, well-informed people, the answer, as you indicate with 87% saying yes, is indeed yes. And again, the Montgomery Foundation is allowed to solicit funding from the community at large, as well as utilize its own funds to further support the Senior Corps program. However, they are not permitted to request or require funds from their Senior Corps volunteers, such as the foster grandparents. In doing so, they violated the terms and conditions of their Senior Corps sponsorship. Now, you say you have a question on this, right?
I do. The question is, may donations be solicited from recipients of CNCS services?
The answer is no. You have to avoid completely the reality and the appearance of there being a quid pro quo. What is allowable, however, is that stations, organizations that receive the placement of RSVP volunteers may voluntarily, on their own, choose to make contributions to support the overall RSVP sponsorship effort. But it can never be that quid pro quo requirement. And that's the major distinction. Any other questions on compensation?
Yes. Can RSVP volunteers donate to your organization on their own?
The fact of the matter is that they may choose to do so, but again, it has to be unambiguously clear that this is an independent free will decision on their part, and there can be no shred of suggestion that this is a requirement that's linked to their ability to serve. They want to do it as a purely charitable function, that's up to them, but it cannot be linked to their service per se.
Great.
Sound good?
Mm-hmm.
Let's move right along to labor. If I can see the next slide. Okay. A sponsor shall not use grant funds directly or indirectly to finance labor or anti-labor organization or related activity. And a sponsor that employs laborers and mechanics for construction, alteration, or repair of facilities shall pay wages at prevailing rates as determined by the Secretary of Labor. So, again, what does that mean for you as a grantee? It means that you'll want to make sure that any organizations you partner with or causes you support do not have a pro or anti-labor component to their work or mission. As well, you want to make sure you are paying a fair and competitive rate to any laborers you hire. So I do have a scenario, if we could see the next slide. And fundamentally, there are several foster grandparent volunteers at a local elementary school, serve at a local elementary school. In response to recent pay cuts, the school's teachers went out on strike. The children's parents organized a meeting and decided that the children, along with the foster grandparents, should get together and make signs in support of the teachers' union. The parents contact the sponsor to invite the volunteers and ask that the volunteers bring any materials they might have to make the signs. So the poll question is, how should the sponsor respond to the parents' request? To approve it or to deny it? And the poll is now open. Melissa, while we're waiting, did we have anything else on compensation?
Yes. We don't have anything on labor, but we have a couple questions from the topic before, one of which is, can RSVP Advisory Council members donate to the program or towards a recognition event?
Absolutely.
Great. How about if we do a 50-50 fundraiser during our annual banquet, are we in violation of the standard related to soliciting funds from volunteers?
No, that's, again, a free will choice. It's hard to go to an event these days that doesn't have a 50-50 raffle, but as long as it's understood it's purely voluntary, people choose to participate or not participate, there's no linkage there between service and a contribution. Okay, well, this one was a slam dunk. The results are in. 97% say deny it, 3% say approve. The collective wisdom of crowds is proven again. The answer is indeed to deny it. The sponsor should deny and inform the parents that the Senior Corps volunteers can't be used directly or indirectly to support or generate support either pro or anti-labor. In this case, their support of the teachers' union would clearly be a violation of that. So thanks very, very much. That one was fairly self-evident. Any questions on labor?
No questions on labor.
Okay. We will move right along. If I can have the next slide on non-discrimination. A sponsor or sponsor employee shall not discriminate against a Senior Corps volunteer on the basis of race, color, national origin, sex, age, religion, or political affiliation, or on the basis of disability if the Senior Corps volunteer with a disability is qualified to serve. This is important. What does that mean to you again in plain English? It means, in short, that you should welcome all that wish to serve and do your best to accommodate any special needs. At the next slide, we'll go to the scenario. A short scenario about Eduardo Jimenez. Eduardo volunteers frequently in Santa Barbara, where he lives. Eduardo is bilingual and is able to support the many Spanish-speaking seniors in the area. Upon hearing about the Senior Companion Program, Eduardo contacted the program director and told her he was interested in becoming a companion. The Senior Companion Volunteer Coordinator declined Eduardo's offer and explained that though Eduardo is fluent in English, that she was concerned that Eduardo's accent may be difficult for clients, many of whom are hard of hearing, difficult for them to understand. So the polling question becomes, has the Santa Barbara Senior Center violated Senior Corps terms and conditions by declining Eduardo to the program? Poll is open. A for yes, B for no. While we're waiting for the compilation, Melissa, any other outstanding questions from past subcategories?
I have a question about non-discrimination, the current section, which is if sexual orientation should also be included in non-discrimination language.
1 second. If I can read my slide here. Well, I mean, I'm not sure if it's just implied or it needs to be more vividly underscored, but under the general heading of race, national origin, sex, I think that could stand to be broadened to include not just gender, but sexual orientation, however you choose to define it for yourself. Let me park that, if I may, have a conversation with one of our folks in general counsel to see if this prohibition needs to be broadened up to include that. I believe the answer is yes.
Great, thanks.
Okay, it's Santa Barbara. Well, again, the wisdom of crowds is is prevalent here. The answer is indeed, as the 97% of you voted, yes. The Senior Center has violated senior court terms and conditions by discriminating against Eduardo based upon his national origin. Any questions that we have about non-discrimination per se?
No, that's it for now.
Terrific. If I could have the next slide, we'll segue over to religious activities. A senior corps volunteer or a member of the project staff funded by CNCS shall not give religious instruction, conduct worship services, or engage in any form of proselytization as part of his or her duties. However, a volunteer station may continue to carry out its religious activities provided that it does not use CNCS funds to support such activities. These activities must be offered separately in time or location from the programs or services funded by Senior Corps. So again, what does that mean to you? It means that you'll want to make sure that any religious activities your organization is involved with are clearly separated from any time or activity funded by the corporation. So if I can move to the next slide with the scenario. Let's review a short scenario about religious activities. Bakersview Christian Alliance serves as the sponsor for an RSVP project. The Bakersview Christian Alliance is affiliated with a local church, but has many programs in addition to RSVP. RSVP meetings are held in the evening to avoid convergence with Bible study classes and other faith-centered volunteer programs. Though the RSVP program coordinator is a member of the associated local church, many of the volunteers are not. The RSVP coordinator is careful to remind volunteers, particularly new volunteers, that proselytization of any type is not appropriate during service activities. So the polling question becomes, has the Bakersview Christian Alliance violated Senior Corps terms and conditions? Yes or no? Yes, A for yes, B for no, and we will rack up the results. In the meantime, while we're waiting for that aggregation, Melissa, any other outstanding questions you might be able to address right now?
Sure. We have a question regarding maybe along the lines of non-discrimination. Can an RSVP program refuse to enroll an undocumented person in the program?
That's a great question. I'll be very candid. I don't know the answer to that. And I need to circle back. I think that the answer may be no, because there are certain benefits, federal benefits associated with your RSVP service that are, I believe, statutorily reserved for individuals who are either U.S. citizens or resident aliens, folks who have green cards. I will double-check that answer because I know that's a hot-button issue these days. I mean, in some states, you can get driver's licenses if you're undocumented, but I believe for federal benefits that there's still a prohibition, but we will double-check with this because it's a significant question, a very well-posed one. Melissa, make sure I circle back and ask for the right answer on this one, okay?
All right.
Okay. So, again, it's another blowout. 97% of you say no, and the answer is indeed no. Bakersview Christian Alliance does not use corporation grant funds to support any inherently religious activities and teaches their volunteers to respect the secular nature of RSVP activities. Furthermore, the RSVP volunteer meetings are held at a time in which no religious activities are in session at the location. So any questions that may have been posed around religious activities?
Yes, there are many.
Okay.
One is, may RSVP volunteers serve at religious stations, such as houses of worship or religious schools?
They can't, the venue itself isn't important. I think we have a lot of activities, legitimate volunteer activities that take place at churches, synagogues, and mosques. But as is the case with Bakersview, as long as there is that separation, that bright line separation between what's religious activity and proselytization on one hand and what's a more generic secular form of service, which RSVP can be about, that poses no problem. The issue, the second part of the question, which I believe is, restate that for me because I don't want to get it wrong.
Yeah, so the question was about if they can serve at these locations, and then you have touched upon what activities are appropriate and not appropriate in those settings. So
right, okay, good.
Yeah.
Before I go on to the last item, which is nepotism, is there any other question around religious activities that attracted a lot of attention?
There are several people asking about prayer before meals, if this violates CNCS policies on proselytization.
I think we've all been to events in which there's an invocation that is offered. You go to a foster grandparent event here in the city of Boston, they will rotate in folks who are ministers or rabbis or otherwise religious leaders who will lead a sort of invocation of blessing, if you will. That, of course, doesn't pose a challenge to us. I think the question here becomes one of degree, and so I don't want to take the sort of easy route out on this, but this is a situation-by-situation case, and I would request that individuals who are thinking they're confronting this, if they think that the weight or the substance of the prayers are so invasive that they create a discomforting environment for folks who are not part of that faith, you need to raise that with your state program office, and we will research it with our attorneys. This can't be a one-size-fits-all. As I say, the sort of generic blessing before meals or invocation doesn't trouble us. Beyond that, it becomes case by case. So let me move on, if I may, to nepotism in the interest of time here. We're coming down the home stretch. Persons selected for project staff positions shall not be related by blood or marriage to other project staff, sponsor staff, or officers, or members of the board of directors, unless there is a written concurrence from the advisory committee, also known as a community group established by the sponsor to provide guidance and resources to your senior corps program. It used to always be called an advisory council. We broadened up the definition so that you don't need a discrete one for each program. But it needs to be some form of community group that provides oversight. In general, the issue is clear that nepotism is not permitted. The only exception, as I mentioned, is to have the written concurrence from what would be described as an advisory council that the sponsor had created, and that you'd have to provide that written notification to your corporation state office. So in general, I think that's where everybody comes down on it. What's it mean for you as a senior corps grantee? It means keep it simple. When hiring new staff, be sure to check if they have family members associated with the organization. If they do, make sure you have written agreement before bringing them on board. And we're not going to have a scenario question on this one, as it tends to be easier to interpret than some of the other activities that we have reviewed. Any questions on nepotism?
Yes.
Okay.
Can an advisory council member be related to the president of the company or organization?
Can the member of the advisory council?
Yes.
Yeah, there's no conflict there. Board of directors would probably be something different. Advisory councils are advisory in nature. They're not a formal part of the governance of the sponsoring organization. They're there to add value from their perspective and bring resources. So that poses, in and of itself, no conflict.
All right. How about under the Senior Companions Program, can you act as the director and have a relative that is a station supervisor in your program?
Good question.
Yeah.
Let me be very direct and say I don't believe that in and of itself constitutes a violation because they're not part of the sponsoring organization itself. But I'd like to double back on that one just to make sure that I haven't interpreted this too broadly. But clearly, there's an individual who works for organization A and an individual who works for organization B. Is there an appearance as well as a reality question of whether or not it could be perceived as the first individual at the sponsoring organization funneling resources to a family member? I don't believe that's a problem, but I will double check.
Great. Similarly, can family members of a senior companion or foster grandparent project director serve as volunteers in their program?
So someone who's a son or a daughter or a parent, is that what we're driving at here?
Yes. So if I am a senior companion director, can my mother serve as a senior companion?
No. Okay. They could both serve as volunteers as long as they weren't serving each other. But no, you can't have a direct relative be a compensated volunteer.
Okay. And one more. Can spouses both participate in a senior corps program?
Yeah, provided they meet the criteria, and sometimes income criteria becomes part of that. But there's nothing that prohibits married couples from serving in the same program.
Great.
I'm going to try to bring this to a close here since we're coming up towards the 50-minute time limit. Can I go to the next slide in terms of compliance? Thank you. So we're down to the last of the three objectives. We've run through the litany of the 7 prohibited activities, and so then there's the inevitable consequences part of it. And so we simply want to bring to everyone's attention that these are serious requirements. And if you use grant funds to engage employees or volunteers in any of these prohibited activities, you may be required to pay back grant funds and could face more severe consequences. Any questions on the compliance side? Okay, I'm going to move to a summary, try and wrap this up. Again, to be specific, we've spent some time on the 7 different categories: political activities, non-displacement of employees, compensation, labor, non-discrimination, religious activities, and nepotism. We do have some time, again, Melissa, if there are some sort of hot-button issues there that a lot of people have coalesced around in terms of questions, we can take a couple of those.
So one of the most asked questions if their questions haven't been answered in this chat session, will they be answered elsewhere? And do you want to provide the answer to that?
Glad you asked that question. It is complicated, which is why there are prohibitions. Yes, we are going to take the questions that you posted in the chat, and our best effort would be that by the beginning of next week, we're going to do some research on this and try to come up with answers, and they will be posted at the site. I believe me, if the WebEx person's here, this is going to stay available for about 1 month. Is that correct?
Yes, the environment will be available for 1 month until Friday, September 5th. And so you can log back into the virtual conference environment and get the answers to these questions that will be posted in the library next week. Perfect.
Yeah, we wanted to make sure we know, people say it's complicated, and then the next part is it's even more complicated than you think. We wanted to not give short shrift to anyone, but some of the questions are more nuanced than others. We do want to perform the due diligence, make sure we get the right answers. We will post them in the library next week. So please feel free to circle back. Play it safe, I'd say the middle of next week, and you should be able to see the responses right there. Any last question, Melissa?
There are many questions in the chat, so I'll look forward to helping to answer them by next week because many of them are pretty nuanced, like you said.
Be ambitious to think that we would address everyone's concerns in these 50 minutes, but we did want to provide a forum to get the general requirements and prohibitions out there, and also a mechanism and a vehicle for you to post these that are, in most instances, very, very specific, and again, some of them go very, very deep. So thank you all very much. We appreciated this opportunity to share some information with you and field your questions. I want to thank Jennifer from WebEx. I want to thank Melissa Allen from our corporation in New Jersey for fielding the questions and aggregating them. And I want to thank all of the participants for your level of interest and engagement. And I hope you're enjoying the conference and that you'll be sticking around for the remainder of the day. So thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.